Brian. I work for Sigma. I've been working for them about 7 years. I'm a technical representative, and I also do some sales for them. I cover mainly the Midwest, so I'm looking forward to giving the class. The overview of the classes, it's just kind of a background. I guess a little bit more than a year and a half ago.
Well, I don't care if I'm muted. I don't see anything.
I'm sorry. About a year and a half ago, we got locked down with COVID, and like everybody, and we were looking for ways to entertain ourselves and also try to create content and do some stuff for people. And the idea of this class is to create to introduce water drop photography in a very basic level. There, you can go way more advanced with what I'm showing here, but it's the idea to be able to grab things that you kind of maybe already have around the house, or if you have to buy, it's not going to be a huge investment into gear to get started at it. And then if you really like the technique and how the results, if you want to spend some more money and dig into it and get more advanced, you can. But this is the kind of like, get you started, give you some tips and tricks to figure it out on your own. And so without further ado, we'll go. And we'll go from there. So there's many types of different type of water drop photography. You can get like the overhead shot, which was kind of in the first one. This is kind of a horizontal shot right at the level, but at the key to most water drop photography, this type is you're gonna drop a water, capture the splash, and it creates these interesting and abstract images like that can be quite beautiful. So some of the must-have items you just kind of have to get started, especially with the technique I'm teaching.
Right.
You need a camera flash. It needs to be an external speed light or strobe is ideal. But you can use like a pop-up flash if you have a pop-up flash on your camera. We need some type of flash. And you need to be able to access the manual mode in that. The manual mode allows us to change how much power the flash is giving. When we're doing this, we don't want to hit it with a full power blast of light. We want to actually hit it with a less powerful flash, and that actually does a better job of freezing the motion. So being able to turn down your flash power is going to be important. Other type of thing is some type of lens that has some macro capabilities, or is a true macro lens. At Sigma, we make several different focal lengths. We make a 70 and 105 currently. 100 millimeters is also very common. There's other lenses out there like some all-in-one zooms that will have macro capabilities. They'll allow you to have close focus. But the key to this is we need to be able to get close to the subjects to focus on it, to create the enlargement of the image. With today's higher megapixel cameras, you can sometimes cheat by cropping in on your subject and things like that. But in general, having a macro lens is going to be a great way to help you get there. Tripod is an absolute must. We're going to have the camera set up. We need it stable and not moving. So a tripod's an absolute must. Hopefully everybody has some water they can use. Just tap water. We all talk about other liquids you can use, but at the heart of it, it's just using plain old water from the tap. Like a plastic zipper bag, a Ziploc bag. A needle to poke a hole in the bag, and some type of tape or clothespins and things like that. I'll explain a little bit more. It'll make a little bit more sense once I get into the kind of how to set everything up. And some stand that's also there. And we need some type of item that we can actually put into water that allows us to focus on it. And all those items I'll explain here in just a minute. So, and the most important thing with water drop photography really is patience. Can't tell you how many I've taken shots. I've spent 15 minutes taking shot after shot, and none of them are quite right. And about the time you're ready to quit, you just say, "I'm going to do it one more time." You take a shot, and you grab that one shot, and that's finally it. So patience is the key here. It is an inexact art. There's a lot of variables that we try to control to make it, repeatable and consistent, but there's still a lot of variables in there that can cause you to miss a shot or not time it quite right and things like that. So patience is key. So the lenses I typically use, like I discussed earlier, like a macro lens in the photography, you'll see I've used all three of these lenses for some of the shots we see. We do have our 105 macro lens, which is our for Canon and Nikon. We do have a 70 millimeter lens, which I love, that I used on Canon 7D for an APS-C. And then we have a newly released 105 macro for like Sony E mount or L mount if you're a mirrorless shooter. For flashes, anything kind of basic to get started. If you have a flash that you can pull off camera, that's great. Any type of speed light works awesome. But when I first started doing this, like the very, very first attempt several years ago on this, I just used my pop-up flash on my 7D. It wasn't perfect, but it definitely got me the kind of figuring out and how to do it and get there. Being able to take your flash off your camera and move it around gives you a lot more creative control. So the latest flash I've been using is the Westcott FJ80s, which is a little bit more powerful flash, which is awesome. But that I get to ask those questions a lot, so I figured I'd just run down the kind of like lenses and gear that I use to take these shots. So, oops. So here's kind of like a basic setup. This is my beautiful spare bedroom that I share with my daughter for my photography projects and her crafting projects. So, I got my tripod, a couple cameras, a flash, a couple bins to catch water, some tape, and different things to get started. So when we put it all together, so I have a light stand here, and I was looking for something to suspend a bag of water over the top of a bucket. So this can really be anything. But again, the idea here was to use what I had available. What did I have available that I could use as a stand? Oh, in the corner, I had an umbrella. So if I took that umbrella and just kind of pushed it over, it gave me this great pole. And then the umbrella actually acted as a way to reflect sunlight when I was doing some different things. So it was kind of handy. Didn't really work as well as I wanted to with the using it to reflect some light, but the pole part worked awesome. So, but anything that you can use to suspend like a water bag or something over the top of a bucket, or what where you're dropping your water in, is what you need. So here's kind of like the overall setup. I've taken the zipper bag, a Ziploc bag, just filled it with water. This has a little food coloring in it to give it a green tone. And then we're gonna basically poke a hole in the bag and just let water drip out of it. So I've taken my, again, my light stand and just put that through and use some, nothing super fancy here, just some duct, some packing tape to tape it on, and to begin my setup of this. At this point in time, I have spent absolutely no money on how to do this. So these are just things I had laying around in the basement in my photography stuff. So, you just need a sharp needle. And what we want to do is poke a very small hole in the bag, and that will let it to start drip. And so when it's hanging there, it's going to drip in a consistent place and going to give us a consistent drip and a consistent spot it's going to hit. And that's very important, because when you're doing water drop photography, you're going to have to pre-focus your lens. If you don't, there's no way your camera is going to be able to find the focus of a falling water drop, no matter how good your camera is, and then take a picture of that splash in that time. So what we're doing is we're controlling all the variables. We're trying to control where the drop is dropping. We're going to try to pre-focus on that area. So when we take the shot, the drop's going to be within the frame, and it's just going to be there. So what we do there is then once it starts dripping, it's going to start creating like you have in your bucket or your setup here. So this is what I was talking about, like something that's submersible that you can focus on. So I have this little tripod I've used. I've taken a pencil and jerry rigged some stuff up But what you need to do is have something where that the water drop is dropping when it drops from the bag. It's going to be dropping consistently in the same spot, but you also need to put something in there that you can manually focus your camera to grab focus and that you can remove later. So what I did here is I taken this little tripod, put it underneath the drop, and it's always hitting the quarter 20 threads. So when I grab manual focus on that for my setup, I know exactly, I get the threads in focus, I take that out, and I know where the drop's going to be dropping within there. So here's kind of an example. I had taken my tripod and kind of flipped it around. I have my Sony here. And what I've done is on the left, you'll see that I've like expanded in and punched in on focus and really dialed in my focus where that water drop is hitting every time. And then on the right side is kind of like one of the first shots from that. You can kind of see on the back of me capturing that image. This is kind of a over the top shot. You can move your camera around to all different positions to get these different types of shots. But this is kind of where I was working at this time. But so grab pre-focus. And this is kind of a shot of just the quarter 20 and the threads, just to kind of show focus and, it's kind of a cool macro shot with all the beads and water on it too. So then when I pull, here's another kind of example of my setup. This is a little bit different. I got into a little bit more complicated stuff here. Is on the back, these shots here, this is kind of your most basic setup. I pre-focused, I have everything kind of like set up, ready to go. This is like when I'm really just beginning. The next setup I have is just kind of to show you some variations on how you can set things up. It's a little bit more complicated. I have a little bit more going. I'm still using the same light stand, the same technique. You see my big old umbrella sitting there, but I put some tissue behind it to give it a little bit different background. And then I've filled the water bowl up to the very, very top so I can get those kind of eye level shots as I adjust things around. There's all different ways you can set this up, but it kind of gives you a different look and feel. So there's another shot of the setup. You can actually catch, you can see an actual splash in the water right there. As we go through and as we start taking shots, this is where kind of like patience becomes the key. What I've done is kind of shown like the pre-focus area here as we're going through. I've kind of started to try to capture a shot. And obviously I've taken my first shot and the water drops at the top. It's getting a little bit lower. It's almost there. I hit this great shot. But if you'll notice, the picture's not very sharp. So this is part of the patience part. So I thought I had my pre-focus set up absolutely right. But if we go back to this shot, it's actually not absolutely perfect. The water drops in front are actually sharper, and this quarter 20 in the back is actually a little soft. So when I was going through and setting up my shot, I didn't actually set it up absolutely perfectly. So that's something you have to kind of like, what I recommend is when we're starting, that's why grabbing that critical focus is so important, because you would hate to go through and spend 30 minutes taking shots, take your card out and go look at stuff and then realize you're off fractionally on focus and all these awesome shots you thought you got are all actually kind of soft. So one of the biggest recommendations I have with this is to get your setup, think you have it dialed in, take some shots, pull the card out and go look at it on your computer. Make sure everything looks good. If everything's looking good and everything looks sharp, then you got your settings. But then you can also know that you might need to dial it in again. And that's what happened here. I went back to the drawing board, moved my focus around and dialed it in. So this is kind of like that kind of the second setup where I did the first setup's kind of that like shooting down on top. This is shooting at kind of water level. And again, parts of this are really sharp and in focus, but parts of it are not. So this has to deal with my f-stop more than anything, but we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. So again, focus plays a critical role in this. I still like the shot a lot, even though there is some little bit blurred out areas. If I did it again, I'd probably up my aperture a little bit, get a little bit more depth of field. But in general, I'm happy with this one. So, and again, a shot where I was going to be perfect, but I think we learn more from what we do wrong than if we did it right. But my focus is soft. Super cool photo, but it's not very sharp. So, But now this one, actually, I finally got my focus dialed in, and it came through. The water drops super sharp. It's so sharp that I can actually get a reflection within the water drop of the kind of like paper I have in the back to kind of create a very cool kind of like three-dimensional image where you're getting the water drop, you're getting the image within the water drop, and then you're kind of getting the abstract image behind it. So, and then now this, I dialed in my focus and I got my depth of field right. This is similar to that very first one I was talking about, but it's all nice and sharp and in focus. And that's all about dialing in your focus and making sure you're hitting the spot where the water drop drops. And it's a lot of talk about that, but that is really one of the real keys to actually doing this type of photography. It's one of the more annoying things, but it is also one of the more one of the things you really have to dial in and test and try. It will try your patience. Sometimes I think it's more frustrating than talking to my 12-year-old about stuff, but when you get it set up and you nail a shot, there's a real sense of accomplishment in it too. So let's talk a little bit about camera settings. I talked a lot about focus there, so we'll move on to some camera settings. When we're doing this, we want to be in manual mode. Pretty much anything manual we can make it. I don't want the camera thinking for me at all. I want to be setting everything up myself. Because as soon as we let the camera think for us, it's not going to actually do what we want, because we're doing a very specialized thing. And we have to really control everything we're doing. If we let the camera decide things for us, then our results aren't going to be as good. So we're going to be in manual mode. You want to set your autofocus to manual. I kind of talked about that with setting your focus, but you want to be in manual. You want to manually focus your lens. You want to set your shutter speed to what we call your flash sync speed. Typically on most cameras, that's either 1/200th of a second, 1/250th second. Every camera is a little bit different. If you have any questions on what that is, you can always just do a quick Google on it and it'll pull it up, Canon or Sony A7 III flash sync speed. And some of it's going to pop up and tell you what that is. Your aperture, the higher the better, because we are doing macro photography and your depth of field is incredibly thin. So we need to make sure we have plenty of depth of field. And with that depth of field, so that everything's in focus. The very first that first shot where I showed you like part of it was in focus and not, that was because I didn't have enough depth of field. I was shooting at like 2.8 on that, so my depth of field was way too thin. On that last shot where in the drops where it was a very similar shot but everything was focused, I was at like f13. So it makes a big difference on what is in focus throughout the image. ISO, if you have a modern camera, this is a little bit more easy to play with, but to do water drop photography, you don't have to have the most modern camera in the world. Since we're doing everything manual, the benefits of having a new camera is, better high ISO. Maybe you can get more frames per second when you're shooting, but most of my shots, when I start out at about like 800 ISO and I adjust accordingly. If I can go lower, I will. A lot of it deals with like the ambient light and the look I'm trying to get. But anywhere from 400 to 800 is a good place to start, and then you can adjust accordingly. But typically, since we're using flash, you can and we're bringing external light, you can pretty much, once you kind of set ISO you like, you can kind of leave it there. Your flash, if you're on camera, you're going to use a flash, you're going to use your speed light or your on-camera flash. Typically where I want to start when I'm using a flash is I want to turn down the power of the flash to -2. I want it to be underpowered. And there's a couple reasons for this. One, if you're not using as much power and we're taking shots really quick and fast, I can get more shots off with the power that's in the flash before it has to recharge. The second thing is when you use a less power, it's a quicker burst of light, and that actually freezes motion better than a big, long, powerful flash. So we'll think of it when you hit a big burst of light, that light's there is longer, and that can actually create enough light that you might get a little bit of motion blur into the image. Whereas if you do a really quick burst of light, it's going to allow you to freeze that splash into space. Sports photographers use this in stadiums with strobes, same type of effect. Most hummingbird pictures, if you've ever seen the hummingbird's wings stopped, have used this type of concept. So it's nothing kind of new. It's just that turning your flash power down will allow you to really freeze your motion. And again, I talked about manual focus. I can't really emphasize this enough. When you're manually focusing, almost every camera nowadays is going to allow you to shoot through the back of the screen in live view, whether it's a mirrorless camera or DSLR. If it's a DSLR, you kind of have to tell it to shoot through the back screen, but that is a much easier way to manual focus than looking through the viewfinder. You can punch in on the image and magnify the image and get critical focus much easier on basically on the LCD screen on the back of the camera than you can looking through the viewfinder. So I highly recommend using the back of the screen, and it's a lot less awkward too. Also, that's very helpful is if you're using an external flash, if you have some type of trigger to fire the flash offhand, like a radio trigger, that's very helpful. But if you're using like a Canon system or Nikon system and you have a pop-up flash on the camera, a lot of times you can use that. You can use the pop-up flash to control the flashes remotely. A lot of the newer cameras have the wireless system just built into the camera. I'm not as familiar with Nikon and Sony's wireless systems. Most familiar with Canon's wireless systems, but they all work pretty much very similar. So let's see. So here's kind of a look at the back of flashes to kind of show what I'm saying. So like on a Canon, you have like in the Q screen or in the back of the screen, you see the flash symbol with a plus minus next to it. So this is when I've turned down the pop-up flash to -1 and 1 1/3. On the right is just a wireless speed light, and I've turned down the power. If it was at full power, it'd be 1/1. At this point, we're at 1 and 1/28. So, and then the M just means we're in manual mode. So we're not using as much power to take that shot. So those are the type that you want to turn down your flash power so we can capture these images. So here's a couple shots. This was used the setup of kind of shooting at the water level. What I did is change the backgrounds. I used tissue paper. One thing that I love shooting in is I always want to shoot raw when I'm shooting these photos. Because they're abstract, you can go into Lightroom or Photoshop and just play with your white balance values. Even if your image is kind of plain and simple, by pulling around your white balance, you can add a lot of color and depth to your images. And since we're not worried about whether somebody's skin tones look green or yellow or make somebody look jaundiced, we can really manipulate an image just by playing with the white balance of it. So in one of the previous images, you might have saw the water being kind of like milky looking. There's other ways we can change the color of the water drops we're getting. One easy way is if you want a more opaque look to your image, using milk, or you can use something like you can water down Elmer's glue to give you like a more opaque look to your images, a more solid look. Instead of I have a couple images I'll show. You can add water, you can add food coloring to the water to give your images a certain look. You can also thicken up your water with glycerin. Glycerin is just used to make soaps. You can find it in most craft stores. You can find it online, and that will allow you, you kind of have to kind of play with the thickness. You don't want to get it so thick that it's not going to drop through the water. your hole on your bag. I might have done that before, so so you got to be careful with your ratio. It's something you start with a little and you add it as it goes. You can see, but it's going to thicken the water up, and so what it's going to do is going to give you a bigger splash because since the water is like denser, it's going to give you a bigger splash. And then also, if you want to change color, you can use gels on top of your flash, so it'll change the color of the light you're using on your flash. All these are pretty inexpensive items to grab. Once I tell you to do it with just regular water first, kind of get your feet wet. Maybe add some food color if you have it laying around the house. The glycerin and the gels, and even added like the more like milk or stuff is a little bit more advanced. Not a lot, but I'd really tell you to kind of try something out and get a hang of it before you spend too much time on it. So here's kind of my setup earlier, what I was showing. So I used milk and I actually colored the milk with watercolor. So you can see I'm shooting into two different vessels. By shooting into the two different vessels, it allows me to get the water right, or the milk right to the very top of that. So when I pull the setup here is not perfect for the camera angle. I actually pulled my camera down lower and shot horizontal straight across the water level just to give me a different angle. But you want to have two vessels, because if you get the water that high, you got to have somewhere where the water will go when it drips. So just kind of vessel and a vessel. So here's kind of a shot with, this is what I use with milk. You can see the Waterdrop is much more opaque. To me, it's just kind of weird, abstract, maybe planet or something floating in there. I don't know. I just really like this image. I had taken my flash off and had placed it on the left side. I don't know if you can see it in the previous image. No, I had my to the left over here, and the reason I can tell you that is like on the Waterdrop, you see, kind of like left back towards the camera, because you see where the light is hitting it on that little drop there. Where you put your flash is something you can just move it around. I usually kind of freehand it and move it around to get different effects. You can put it on a stand and move it around that way, but by adjusting it and moving it around in different places, it'll give you different looks and feels on your shot. I always felt like this was an otherworld amoeba coming after us or something. I played around with this one in Photoshop. I just took the white balance and really messed around with it to kind of create the surreal colors. Again, this is with the milk, that more opaque look. You're not able to actually see kind of through it. I really do like that effect. That's what I've been playing around with more lately. This to me it should be like in Star Wars, a planet rising up in the sky. If anybody's ever used any type of AI software to keyword their images, that's exactly what I thought it was. I thought it was a planet. So to me, it's very cool. It has that kind of weird misty quality to it. And then here's kind of a more top-down shot.
Screenshot it.
And then that is my basic water drop. That's the basic dropping part there. Let me see. I can pull open chat to see if there's any questions, or anybody have any quick questions I can ask before I move on to the next section. So Monica, that was just the water. I wasn't using any dry ice or anything. It's just kind of, I just hit that at the right. Monica's asking if I use dry ice on the kind of planet one to create that look. And that was just capturing the image at the absolute right time to kind of create that kind of misty look. It's very interesting. Yes, it's Mars. So I think Lois is asking about glycerin. When I'm using the glycerin in the Waterdrop photography, I just put maybe an eighth of a solution to eighth of a 1/8 to 7/8 water. Anything I go light, because I have messed it up in my past. where I put too much glycerin in, and then my water was too thick and wouldn't want to come through the hole. So you got to kind of be careful with. I actually prefer the glycerin works good, but I prefer using an actually just a thicker thing, something like using the milk, which is more, it's thicker, but it's not it's it's more dense. I like to use that. Maybe it's just because it's easier to get the ratio right. You just go grab some out of the fridge and put it in a bag. So
Have you varied
Monica
the height?
asked Monica asked, is my flash on the camera? I typically use an off-camera flash. So I use a 70 Mark II and an R6 and an Sony A7 III. The A7 III I have a trigger setup, so it has a wireless trigger for the flash. The Canon system will wirelessly talk to my Canon flash, so those are there. But you can, if your camera does have a pop-up flash, you can use it. Or if you don't have any wireless triggers, you can just use a speed light sitting right on top of it. Your light's just going to be more direct hitting on. You don't have as much control of where your light's going to go. It's just going to be hitting straight onto the drop instead of off to the side. So let's see. And Mildred asked me, very basic question: do you synchronize your shutter release to the water dropping? Yeah, so I think maybe I didn't mention this. Maybe I skipped over it and I left a bullet point out. So one of the key settings that you need to do is you want to shoot on continuous focus. You want to take as many shots as you possibly can at once, because so you can time. You want to time when you hit the shutter. If you have a shutter release, that works great too. Is you want to time it to when you think the drop's going to be going, and then you're just going to hold it down and take 5, 6, 7 shots all at once, because no matter how good you think your timing is, it's never as good as you think it is. So you need to take more shots than you possibly can to make sure you're going to grab that. A lot of times you can get, if we go back to this kind of sequence, there we go. So like this sequence here, sometimes you'll get 2 or 3 drops in in a row. I have not done it personally, but you could also say you had one drop here and then the drop here and you had a splash here and it was all in the same sequence. You could easily drop those into Photoshop together and create a nice blended image. So taking more than one shot is really important. Yeah, I think we asked, can you cover your lighting difference between a low angle point of view with overhead point of view? I typically always have my flash off to the right or left. I only have one flash, so you can do this with multiple flashes too, but I typically am going to have the flash almost at the level of the water, just to the right or left, and then I'll move it at various angles from that. You'll notice that a lot of these shots, it's always to the left because I'm right-handed, and I'll hit the camera with my right hand and hold the flash with my left hand. And so you'll see where the shadows are, especially like in these drops, you'll see the shadow always on the right-hand side. And that's just something I do. You can move it around to the left-hand side if you want. There's no real strict rules to this. Camera settings. Typically in manual mode again. I think I went over that. You want to be at your flash sync, your aperture, the higher the better. And a tripod, the tripod I'm using there is a Benbro. It's just a very solid tripod. One of my best advice to anybody ever buying a tripod is please don't do what I did and buy the $30 tripod that broke after 2 months and then decided I'd spend $60 on a tripod that broke after 5 months. Just buy a good, solid, moderately priced tripod that'll last you a really long time. And then if you get really serious with your photography and you use your tripod a lot, go spend a little bit of money to buy a carbon fiber tripod and it'll last you the rest of your life. I've spent too much money on tripods is what I'm getting at. If I would have just done it right the first time. I have somebody. So Steven is asking me, can you use a steady light source instead of a flash? I've never really tried, Steven. So to do that, the way you would do that is you would have to have a camera with a very fast shutter speed, like at 1/8,000th of a second or something, to be able to capture the motion. So it's possible. I just find the flash to be a lot easier than to get enough light hitting the subject, and but it's definitely something you could try, which would be great. Good. Yep, I think sharing almond milk would work just as well as whole milk. Yeah. And then I'm asking about 2 speed lights. If you're using more than 1 speed light, I would typically have one as my key light and just one be like kind of like a rim light. You would turn that one down a lot more. I would try to probably diffuse the second light, but it would be definitely something you could play with. It would probably give you a more balanced light. It would be definitely something you could do though. So Bonnie's asking me if some of my images are underexposed. Some of the images I do like them underexposed to kind of create that contrast. It's just all taste. Some of my very first images are like these here. That is definitely super underexposed, but those were also test shots. So, and then one of the first images, this I underexposed it to kind of create that contrast that I really liked. So it's all personal taste on a lot of the stuff. There is no set rule. A lot of it's just how you like it and what you're seeing. So, so next type of water drop photography. And if you guys have some more questions about this, we'll go back to it and I'll answer more questions at the end too. So keep them coming. So my second one is what I call static water drops. And that's when we take a water drop and we intentionally place them to create an image within a water drop. If anything, this can be is more time consuming and patience because getting a water drop to sit perfectly on a limb and then to get everything set up perfectly behind it to take the image can be a test in patience, but it can also be very rewarding. So there's a couple different ways to get the drops on there. So you can use like a water bottle with a sprayer. You can kind of mist something until the water gets, kind of keeps on growing to create a water drop. This is where I think glycerin really comes in handy. The glycerin adds a lot of viscosity to the liquid, so you can get bigger water drops. Again, we want to use a macro lens. Again, you can use a tripod with this, but you don't have to. I tend to actually not use a tripod when I'm shooting the water drops unless I'm doing something very, very specific, because I like to move around to get different angles on the shots. You can use autofocus on this because you're focusing on a specific place. And so by moving around and having a good autofocus system, you can nail it there. But being on a tripod does let you dial in your focus to the utmost if you're really trying to nail something super critical on focus. And again, one of the things I find to be helpful is a syringe or cake tester to place the water drop exactly where I want them. And that's typically my preferred way to do this. Using the water barrier sprayer is kind of random on where the drops will form. Whereas if you use a syringe or a straw, the direct like almost like a coffee straw to place the drops, that works really, really well. So let's go. I'll kind of show you some examples here. So here's my kind of like setup of one of those first images. You saw I have this branch, I have these kind of dried out flowers I grabbed, and I was trying to shoot that kind of flower through the water drop. And to place the drops on there, I used this cake tester dipped into my water solution, which was glycerin and water, and was kind of placing them on the table to get them where I want them to be. So as I set up, I was on my tripod, and again, I was using live view to get everything to go. Since I was using a tripod, I actually didn't use my flash here, so I could be at whatever, I'm at 1/15th of a second. I typically can't handhold that, but since I'm on the tripod, I can easily get that type of shot at that slower shutter speed. But as I was playing around, I was composing with the live view to kind of give me a feel for what the image would look like, which is nice because you can see the shallow depth of field and what might be happening behind it as you're composing the image. So here's this one. You can see here, I didn't, so it lit up nice. You can see the flower behind it. The one thing here is I couldn't get the drop quite big enough to make the flower quite as big as I wanted in here. Overall, I love the colors and the feel and the texture of this. I mean, the image, the macro lens does a wonderful job to show the details of that branch and everything. So overall, I like the image, but it wasn't 100% what I wanted it to be. So then I was like, oh, let's try this. And so as I was kind of setting up and doing it, I was playing around with some constant lights, which definitely work. But what you have to really be careful of when you're shooting through the Waterdrop is that it acts almost like a fisheye lens, and that it grabs everything that you possibly can think of in the image. So I had this constant light here over on the left of the drop that you can obviously see. And if you get very, very closely, I'm actually holding the flower in the background, and you can actually see my hand in the Waterdrop. That's when we get into Lightroom and really explode the image. So one thing you got to be careful of is your elements around your working area. With those drops, they're going to grab such a wide angle of view because it's almost acting like a fisheye lens, and it gives you such a wide angle of view. You got to be careful of what you're putting in them. So here's kind of an expanded it. You can definitely see the light in there. So, and then here, you can definitely see my hand. I was moving some stuff around and I was thinking, oh, I'll hold the flower in the place I need it to be, right? So I'm showing you guys all my mistakes, so you hopefully don't have to figure out everything I did. So as I was doing that, I'm like, oh, that's great. My hand's in it. So, you know, there's my beautiful hand. You can see the windows in the back. I mean, it's not, the idea of the image was great, but the way it actually turned out in execution wasn't that awesome. But the macro lens is incredibly sharp, though. We know that. So good equipment, photographer bad. So then I started playing around a little bit more, getting a better composition. I'm liking this a little bit where the actual water dropping is a little soft. So this is where manual focus would come in handy. I could dial in my focus a little bit better to have that flower be a little bit sharper in the drop. And then one thing, but we're getting really close there. I got a great image at the end. I'll show you where everything nailed. This kind of goes back to kind of tie the two things together. Here I'm actually using a water drop to emphasize the background within the Waterdrop photo. So, which is pretty cool. I was just using wrapping paper as my background. So those like kind of circles and everything were there, and they kind of shows off how they're amplified within the drop to give you that kind of lens effect. And I was shooting at a pretty shallow depth of field here. That's why the background is just kind of obliterated. You don't really see anything of it. Here's kind of another shot, that kind of water drop feel. But this is my best water drop shot. This shot took me forever to do, but I was able to create a very compelling image, and actually one of my favorite images I've ever created. You know, the lilies were my wife's favorite flower. We had gotten some for I got some for an anniversary, and by the time I had set this up, I had gone through some ridiculous lengths to get the right size on it and everything. But I had used a teleconverter to get extra magnification, so I couldn't breathe basically without the lens moving. But I had done a glycerin solution, and I had placed the drops, and I had misted it, and I had got everything just perfectly in place. So everything finally came together to kind of create this type of image, which I'm very proud of. With other images as I was working through to create were things I learned along the way to help create this image here. So, and that is it for the water drop stuff. Let me stop my share and I can answer some questions. I can remember how to do that. There we go. Okay, let's go. So, let me go back here. So, let's see. Somebody's asking me, I guess back on the regular Waterdrop photography, am I using an assistant to help me setting up the materials, playing with the materials? No, I'm pretty much doing everything by myself. Having an assistant would make life a lot easier. So if you do have somebody around if you're doing this at home, you have somebody to help you hold stuff, life becomes a lot easier. Having an extra set of hands, or my favorite thing in life is a voice activated light stand, or my wife holding my flash for me where I tell her to, is always very, very helpful. But it can be done without it. All those shots I typically work by myself. I get in this kind of weird zone and I just start and play around with stuff, and it takes me a while to do stuff, and my wife gets bored, so she moves on. So Bing is asking, am I using AI servo mode on the Waterdrop shots? Yes. If I'm moving around a lot, I'll use continuous autofocus. And I'll actually use like a lock on autofocus, and lock on the spot that I want it to be focused and move around. So, have I ever played around with juice? I have not used juice, so it might be something to try, but I have not used it. Sandra's asking about using a ring light. That would totally viable, especially on the Waterdrop shots. I just don't have a ring light, so that's why I didn't use one. So, thank you, Monica. It is one of my favorite shots on the Lily. So the Waterdrops on the last image, those were water. They were just like a quarter glycerin, 3/4 water, and I placed the drops where I wanted to, and then I misted the whole lily, the whole stalk with a mister to kind of create not just having the drops on it, but to create the illusion that it was kind of like a dewy morning. What is the difference between the flower and the stem? There was probably a good 3 feet between the flower and the stem. It was actually a lot further than I expected. As I was playing with it, it took me a while to get that distance just right. Orlo, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. You could use mirror lockup 5-hawk, but one of the things I typically shooting through is live view, or I'm using a mirrorless camera. So when you're shooting through live view, you're just seeing the sensor anyway. So the mirror is already locked up. And then on a mirrorless camera, you don't have to worry about it. So you could use that, but I typically, on this type of work, this type of macro work in general, I always shoot through live view when I'm not using a mirrorless camera. Jan, you can do the Waterdrop stuff outside. It's just more complicated. Doing it inside is a lot easier because we're not dealing with the elements, namely like wind. And wind will play havoc with your image, especially when you're trying to get things set up. But you can definitely do it, and I've seen much better photographers than me do stuff where they put Waterdrops on things and shot them outdoors. How did I get the background? The white background? My background behind the lily was just white, so they just kind of showed up white in there. Raj, I don't have a picture of the setup for that. I lost a hard drive with some of my BTS stuff, so I haven't been able to get it recovered. So I have the shot. That's what I'm really happy about. Shu, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. So John's asking, what do you want to put in the Waterdrop it? Is it typically the direct opposite? You can put whatever you want in there. I tend to just like flowers. other people, you are going to get a reverse of the image. So if you put any words or anything, you have to think twice about how you set it up if you want it to read right side up. I have seen some really cool water drop photographies where they'll have some type of like saying or something reflected in the water drop, and I think you have to turn it upside down for it to come forward. I don't remember 100%. It's blatantly obvious when you see it that you have to how you have to change it. So Kate's asking a basic question, and it's she's a beginner. So what's the difference between a macro lens and a telephoto lens? So this is where it gets complicated, Kate, but a telephoto lens is typically any lens that's greater than, say, 50 millimeters. So like a 70 millimeter lens, an 80 millimeter lens, a 100 millimeter lens. Those are all considered telephoto lenses. They're bringing your subject that's farther away closer to you. A macro lens is defined in how, in simple terms, it's defined in how close it can focus to something. So the closer it can focus to something allows it to make that bigger. In the macro world, we talk about 1-to-1, and that's a 1-to-1 reproduction. So I can get close enough, it will actually create what that would look like in real life. In practical terms, though, it means you can focus close so the image looks, you're getting a closer detailed, a more detailed image. So not all telephoto lenses are macro lenses, and not all macro lenses are telephoto lenses, because there are some like 35 millimeter macro lenses and such, which would be considered a wide angle lens. But they really, the two terms don't have to do with this. A telephoto lens is just, it's taking a subject that's far away and bringing it closer to you. So if I was doing a half a cup of water, how much glycerin would I put in it? I would start with maybe like an eighth of a cup and go from there. I would adjust accordingly. Let's see. Looks like Joseph is has some tubing and setup. I'll have to maybe kind of look at that, Joseph, a little bit more advanced setup. So Sandra's asking what size macro lens. I would suggest anything a 50 millimeter or longer on a crop sensor camera like the Sony A6600. I mean, our 105 macro is an amazing lens. If you can afford it, it is simply stunning. That's what I would totally recommend. It runs, I think, don't totally quote me on this. My sense of pricing has totally gone wrong, about $8.99. So it's not on the cheap side, but it is a very, very good lens. Sony does make some more entry level lenses that might work too, though. So, best macro lens for a Canon T7. I would tell you to go look at our 105 macro. It's a full frame lens, but it'll work great on a T7. It has image stabilization built into it. It won't break the bank. It's about $589 right now, I think. It'll be a lens if you moved on to a full frame camera, you could take right with you. Let's see. Russ is asking me if I use electronic smart triggers, and no, I haven't, Russ. This was all more of a setup just to keep things pretty inexpensive in what you have. And Janine's asking me what lenses I use. I use 105 macro for Sony, and then for Canon, I use our 70 macro when I'm on a tripod. That lens does not have stabilization, so it's not maybe as great to move around when you're doing macro work when you're not on a tripod, but it is a great lens when you're on a tripod. If you're moving around a lot when you want to do your macro stuff, our 105 macro for Canon and Nikon is like a great lens. It's one of our little bit older lens, but it's still a great lens. Nope. 105 macro on the A6000. Nope. I actually would prefer using the 105 macro on the A6000, A6600. It's because it gives you more working distance. The crop sensor on that gives you more length to your telephoto. So I wouldn't actually have to be on top of the subject quite as much to get the magnification I would need. I actually prefer to do when I can, when I have a camera to use, I use a crop sensor camera for my macro work to give me that extra working distance. My favorite macro combination for the longest time was a 7D and our 70 macro, until we came out with the 105 macro recently for the Sony. So do I have any Canon RF mount macro lenses? You could use the 70mm macro on a R mount, but you would have to use the adapter. It works great, and the benefit to using the R mount would be with our cameras, you would get stabilization on that lens now. So a Pentax K5. Unfortunately, we don't make any macro lenses for it, for the Pentax anymore. I would just look at what Pentax has in their lineup that they actually make. They do make some good lenses. I would attend to that. The hard questions are coming. What inspires you in your photography and Waterdrop photography? So for my job until this last year, I traveled a lot, maybe 150 days a year on the road. So a lot of my inspiration for travel is for the photograph is stuff around me. You know, what can I go out and shoot? So I typically do a lot of landscape, nature, architecture photos. When I'm home, you know, the Waterdrop stuff has always interested me. So when I was home for a long time, I just kind of pulled it out and kind of just started doing some stuff. Bing is asking, can you use some macro tubes for that? Totally. You can definitely use extension tubes to give you some greater distance to that. Somebody asking me about micro four thirds. I don't see us making one for micro four thirds, but I could be wrong. I get surprised every day. The new lenses we just released were a 24mm and a 90mm, and I never suspected that those would ever show up. So we do stuff to surprise what we're going to release on lenses all the time. I would like to create a kind universe in the planets I shoot. So, yeah, I mean, if you're looking for lenses, you know, the used market, one thing about lenses is as camera technology changes, that's like a regular consumer electronic, you replace that a lot. You can buy a lens and have it for 10 years. It's a great investment, and it's the easiest way to improve your image quality is to buy a good lens. That being said, I do work for a lens company, but I still firmly believe that. I had a friend that has been in the industry for a long time, and he said you date your camera and you marry your lenses. So, if I were ever to be a tattoo person, that would be the tattoo I'd get. So, I want to thank everybody for attending. I think that kind of ended all the questions for right now. I think from here, I appreciate everybody for coming. Hopefully I taught you a little bit of something new and exciting, and everybody have a great night.
Brian, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was an incredible evening of information, some great images, and your insight into this is just makes me so excited to go out and take more pictures. Yeah. So thank you very much for joining us.
I appreciate it.
I'm sorry?
I appreciate you guys having us, and sorry it was a little bit late, but we got to go. And so
definitely worth the wait and the issues there. And I want to thank everybody else for joining us tonight. Please stop by our store, shop us on Samys.com, and check back Samy's PhotoSchool schedule of all of our upcoming online classes and information. So thank you, everybody, and have a great evening.
Okay, thank you. Have a great night. Thank you.